Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our panel on discussion on the evolving definition of relevant markets. So the aim today is to explore how the recent updates of the European Commission guidelines are reshaping the landscape of definition market, taking into account new markets, economic changes, and shifting consumer behavior. So to guide us through this topic, we have three distinguished speakers. Amélie Lavenir, which is the head of competition at LVMH and a former competition lawyer at Clifford Chance doing more than 10 years. Liliana Eskenazi, partner at Fréget, Glaser et Associés, and also senior competition lawyer. And Emmanuel Fréget, which is a competition economist and principal at Analytics Group. And I am Antoine Labaille, also partner at Fréget, Glaser et Associés. We are a law firm based in Paris and specialized in competition law, European law, and regulatory law. So our discussion today will cover several key areas, and we will begin with an overview of the new guidelines. Then try to moving into specific issues, such as the role of price, especially in the luxury market and the digital markets, and also the role of non-price factor, which is now taken into account in the new guidelines. So to begin, maybe let's look at the broader context and the key development in market definition. So Liliana, maybe you could briefly outline the main development and tell us if, from your perspective, the new guidelines are more big changes or an adaptation of practices?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. Yeah, that's a very interesting question because I think that everyone here in the room, at least those who have had a very long time or short time ago an introductory course in competition, have probably started by learning what is a market definition and what is an undertaking. So these are the 101 concepts of competition law. And we have had a market definition notice dating back to 1997 that has stayed there for, let's say, 25 or 30 years. And the Commission has just published last February an updated version. So the question is, what has changed in those 30 years? Aside from the volume, because for those of you who have read the new notice, they may have noticed that from 9 pages we have now 35. And I've also looked at the footnotes. Back then in 97 we had, I think, 3 or 5 footnotes, which were mainly explanatory, and only one with a reference to the Hoffmann-La Roche 1979 judgment about what is dominance. And today we have 166 footnotes with a lot of case law. So it's maybe a positive development in the sense that it's a nice reference now for what has changed over the years and how the Commission has applied the Commission and the European courts have applied the concept of market definition. But more on the substance, so what has changed over the last years and why this new version of the notice has become necessary. Obviously, from an economy market perspective, a lot, and you can see it already in the introduction of the notice that starts by explaining what the objective of competition policy is and how market definition plays a role. Whereas before, in the 90s, we had a very, say, static view of the markets and a very, the purpose of competition policy was mainly viewed as achieving economic efficiency. Today, the objectives incorporate, say, a more holistic view of what the economy is, and the objective that today sound like buzzwords, but that have become an integral part of a role of competition. And we're talking here about sustainability, digital transformation. So all these changes over the last 30 years have now been taken into account and acknowledged by the Commission as things that count in competition analysis. And so market definition, from a simple tool and prerequisite for the competitive assessment has become now something that's still a tool, but more an intermediate tool. There's a lot of references to this term intermediate tool to convey the idea that, well, market definition is important, but it's only one part of overall competitive assessment that nowadays takes into account not only concepts like product substitutability, which was the key idea in the definition of the relevant market in the previous framework. But today you take into account more and more the factors that go beyond that and account for these changes. So more specifically, what does it mean? So the integration of the terms of the objectives of sustainability and the role that competition policy plays in creating more resilient markets. So these are again buzzwords, but that are part of the market relevant notice today. Today you take into account the methods that are used in defining the market go beyond the simple price test that was, the tool used to define whether two products are part of the same market, but you will take into account factors such as quality, innovation, differentiation of products, and factors that go beyond the simple effective interchangeability of products, but more into how consumers perceive that and what are the other factors that play in the choice that consumers make and which affect the whether two products or two services will be considered as part of the same relevant market and as exercising sufficient competitive constraint over each other. In terms of new concepts or new chapters in the new notice, I'll just mention, but I think that we'll come back to that in the discussion later on, the fact that today the developments on the digital market includes products that are much more complex, that interact in much more complex ways. We're talking here about multi-sided platforms, about online market platforms. So all this is accounted into the new competition notice and is part of the analysis. So there is we'll say an updated methodology to take to acknowledge all these changes that have occurred, and there is a more emphasis on forward-looking assessments. The assessment is more dynamic, focused on the dynamic changes on the market. And it's no longer a simple static analysis of the level of concentration. And I found that there was a lot of connection in the presentation that was just before this panel, which explained all these factors about the role of concentration, but not only today, with discussion over entry, exit into the market. Just one last point. Obviously, the time that has passed since the previous notice has played a role and explains how these evolutions have been incorporated in the new guidance. But as some of you may remember, in 2019, where the discussion about the market definition started, there was the Siemens-Alstom merger that was blocked, and we generated a lot of debate. And as you may remember, there was a joint declaration by the French and German governments that stated that well, the new commission that at the time was being formed should seriously consider revising, modernizing competition law, and in particular the market definition, because at the time when this merger was blocked, a lot of politicians were regretting that competition from the Chinese market or future competition, potential competition from Chinese markets had allegedly not been taken into account by the Commission. So one of the purposes of this revision, aside from obviously time that has passed, was also to account for, take into account this more dynamic analysis of what market definition is.
Thank you, Liliana. So maybe before moving to specific topics, Amélie, you want to bring some practical views on reaction to what Liliana said?
Yeah, well, I think generally I agree. I think clearly there is some sophistication in the market definition, and this whole new guidance, which is much longer, includes more details and shows that the approach is just more sophisticated. I think one point that drew my attention as a recent in-house lawyer was the focus and the very brief section on how to take into account product differentiation in the market definition, which obviously I think in the luxury sector is particularly relevant because it is a sector where attachment to brand and products are highly differentiated, and the differentiation can evolve significantly over time, so it's differentiated and dynamic. And on this, unfortunately, there is very little guidance. So there is an acknowledgement that this is relevant, but a simple statement that says that there are markets where products are differentiated, and then, well, either there is one market with different products, or there are separate markets, which I guess is a helpful statement, but doesn't provide much guidance on how to take it forward. And unfortunately, if this is not more concrete, and if we stay at a stage where we have to look at every plausible market, it doesn't really help very much, because we can look at all of the potential market segmentation, which is incredibly burdensome for companies. And I think whilst it's welcome that this is explicitly stated, in my view, it lacks a bit of practical guidance on what do we do next. And I think that applies to other sections of the specific cases. I mean, it's very helpful to have a section that shows that there are specific circumstances that are more difficult. But from my perspective, I feel there is a bit of a gap on what we do with those difficult situations, because in my view, they seem to apply to most cases. I mean, if we look at it, it applies to digital differentiated products. And in a world where markets and products are more complex, interact with each other a lot more, and boundaries are blurred, I think that was the guidance that we would have needed.
Okay, thank you. But if we look at Amélie, if we look at the role of price, which is traditionally the main factor to define market and under competition, with the well-known SNP test, which is the one which is used to assess price-based competition. But in some specific markets, such of course at luxury, high prices often signal exclusivity rather than competition. So do you see in practice, do you see that it could challenge the legal framework, or does it challenge the traditional approaches to market definition in the luxury sector?
I think, clearly from the new guidance and from what I've seen so far, I think price is still, and I'm sure Emmanuel will elaborate on this, but it is generally considered as the main factor to delineate markets. Unfortunately, there are industries where that does not really apply, and I think luxury is one of them. As I've discovered empirically since I've joined the group, we are indeed in an industry where price is not just price, and it does not really express competition, but it is part of the product in a way. Price creates desirability. It is, in luxury, people want expensive items for what that means. So paying the high price is actually the statement you want to make when you purchase a luxury product in many circumstances, for a gift or for yourself. So it's a market where, and again, I'm not an economist, but what I've seen is that price increase does not mean demand decrease, quite the opposite. There is a lot of products for which a price increase will drive demand, and I think one recent example, which is in the US obviously, but the Birkin bag of Hermes is an extremely expensive bag. It is not even available to everyone, and it's driving people insane, properly insane. There's a class action in the US on an alleged dying of products. But that shows how, I don't think if the price went down, the demand would go up. I think the demand is up because it is so exclusive, and the price is a function of that. And therefore, I think this is typically a market where starting with price to define the market is erroneous and does not work, simply because we're not competing on price. And I think this is a message that's been carried to the authorities and does not seem to be heard. I mean, and there is economic demonstration of the Veblen effect. I mean, it's something that is brought forward on a regular basis in market definition, in merger control, in antitrust cases, and it is not even reflected. I mean, there is a footnote missing here, I think, in the 100 footnotes. And I think this is, and there's a gap again in this thing, and lack of acknowledgement that price is not always the starting point. Not saying that it's completely irrelevant, but not always a good starting point.
Thank you very much. So it leads us to Emmanuel. Emmanuel, I think what is called in economy is Veblen goods, which is when demand increases with the increase of price. So how do you suggest that competition economists can adapt their model to capture this effect and to do it in practice?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Antoine. I mean, and thanks a lot for having me on this panel. So as you said, I mean, the luxury markets are pretty specific because the prices doesn't play the role that it does on, say, standard markets. So one specific feature is what you describe as Veblen goods. So just to make you understand what this is, Veblen goods are goods where demand increases with prices. So the higher the price, the higher the demand. Of course, this goes against the standard intuition that if you increase the price, fewer consumers are willing to buy a good because we find it too expensive, and so demand is going to decrease. So how do we get such a result? Well, for Veblen goods, the explanation is that people consume a good not only because they like the value of the good, but because they like the signal that it sends to others. So that's what we call conspicuous consumption. So I like to consume something that's very expensive because it signals that I'm very rich, and so people are going, to think that I'm rich, which I am. Okay, so that's really the reasoning. So if you want to think about it in terms of like concepts in economics, this is what we would call a negative network effect. So network effect is something that says people want to consume more of a good when more people are buying. So classical example, mobile phones. Okay, if I am the only one owning a mobile phone, that's completely useless. But if all my friends have a mobile phone, then I want to buy one. Something for social media, so for social networks, things like this. If all my friends are on Facebook, then I want to be on Facebook. Okay, so that's the typical example. For Veblen goods, it's exactly the opposite. If everyone consumes something, then I don't want to buy it, okay, because that doesn't signal anything about my social status. So I enjoy the fact that few consumers purchase the same good. So that's very specific to luxury. Well, if you are in such a situation, then if you increase prices, fewer consumers purchase the good, which I enjoy even more, I want to buy more of the good, okay? So that gives you the positive relationship. The important point is that Veblen goods is a kind of extreme effect, right? So you don't need Veblen goods to have like these negative networks. You may actually have a downward sloping demand curve, but just it's less negative, the slope is less negative than without these effects, okay? So that will also play an important point. The other thing is that you may have other reasons why you do care about the prices, is that price on a luxury market may be interpreted as a signal of quality by consumers. So it's not that people want to signal that they have a high social status, it's just that they think that it's that expensive, it must be very high quality, the producer just do the same. They want the people to think that it's high quality, so they produce a high quality goods, and then you have a kind of self-fulfilling market where prices with goods with a high price have a high quality. Okay, so just to sum up these 2 points, the key point in the industry, as Amélie said, is that prices are not only a transfer from producers to consumers, which they are in standard markets, but they also convey some information about the goods or how people think about consuming the good. Okay, and so that's a key difference. So does it matter, actually? So let's be a bit practical in terms of market definition or market power or mergers. Well, actually, I think it does. So I will take 3 very simple examples. Start with the SNP test. So the SNP test is still a key concept in market definition. If you look at the new guidelines, it's mentioned 28 times. So that's almost, one mention on each page. So obviously, that does matter. And so, as most of you know, I guess, the SNP test consists in applying a small price increase, usually 5 to 10% to a set of goods, and check whether this price increase is profitable. If it is, then these goods belong to the same relevant market. Okay, so that's the whole concept behind the market definition. Well, with a Veblen good, that doesn't work anymore because you have to apply the test starting from a competitive setting. So you have to take the prices on a perfectly competitive market, increase them, see if that's profitable. Well, that may be profitable with Veblen goods just because they are Veblen goods. Does that mean that each Veblen good is a market? No, it doesn't. Okay, you still have competitive constraints. So you see that the whole conceptual approach to market definition with these types of goods is not going to work. The second example is market power. So usually we define market power, at least we measure market power as a gap between the prices and the marginal cost of the firm. And that makes perfect sense on standard market because the price that maximizes consumer surplus is a marginal cost. So if you see a wage between these two values, then you can say, well, this firm is at least enjoying some market power, and that may or may not be an issue on this market. Does that work on luxury markets? Well, not necessarily, because if you increase the price on a luxury market, you have the standard effect that fewer consumers are going to buy it. That's a decrease in the consumer surplus. But there is also the effect that some people who are still buying the good are enjoying it even more because you have fewer consumers purchasing it. Okay, so you have a negative and a positive effect. The net effect may well be positive, and so actually the price that maximizes consumer surplus may not be the marginal cost. Okay, so this is a very different setting from standard goods, and you may reach the conclusion that actually it's pretty beneficial to consumers that the firm is enjoying some market power. Okay, I'm not saying that you should go to the monopoly, but at least some market power may increase consumer surplus. And my third example, and I will stop with this one, is mergers, and you can see that we'll have exactly the same effect. On a merger, we usually use pricing pressure indexes that let us understand if the merger is likely to increase prices. And usually, if we find that it does, then that raises some competition concerns. Well, with luxury markets, that's not the case anymore, because for exactly the same reason, if we find that the merger is likely to increase prices, then that may be beneficial to consumers. Okay, so is that good? Is that actually the merger beneficial to consumers? Well, it may be, which would be a completely different conclusion on a standard goods market.
Emmanuel, Liana, you want to add something on this specific topic before we switch on the non-price factors?
Maybe just a short reaction on this question of luxury goods and how they are assessed in competition with a concrete recent example from the French case law. The French Competition Authority has issued several decisions lately on restrictions on online sales, and this is something that has become now quite settled in EU law based on judgments of the Court of Justice, in particular in the Pierre Fabre case and in the Coty case, and we have more or less an idea of how, and this was, by the way, reflected also in the latest version of the vertical block exemption regulation and the guidelines. So now we have several examples from the French case law where restrictions on online sales have been sanctioned, and one of them, one of the recent ones, was in the luxury watch sectors. And Rolex was fined a considerable amount of fine, around 90 million. So there were some very interesting issues, I think, that relate to some extent to the market definition, both in terms of role of price and Veblen goods, and there was debate in this case about whether price is really a factor of defining the relevant market or even of competition, in the sense that when you restrict a sales channel, you probably reduce the availability of goods on the market. At least that's the theory that was developed in the decision, and therefore the products become more expensive. But as Emmanuel just explained, this is precisely one of the effects of those type of goods, that the higher the price, the more desirable the products become. And so there is also a question of even the shortage of the availability of those goods on the market, because the production is very, very small. They are desirable precisely that because they are not available and because their price is high. So it was interesting to see how these elements were or were not accounted for in the decision. And I think that what we have now in the new relevant market notice does not necessarily help to overcome these issues and to have a more case-specific analysis. What is maybe good in the Commission notice is that the analysis now is much more open, and so it's just a phase of the competition assessment. It's maybe one of the elements, one of the tools that are supposed to be used by competition authorities, but not necessarily in all cases. And there should be much more account taken of specific factors depending on the good itself, depending on the market conditions, and depending on factors such as, price is not the relevant criterion for establishing the interchangeability of goods and how the competitive constraints play on these type of markets. And the second point, but this is a small one and it's also related, is that in these type of cases, these precedents in France now recent, we see how the role of online markets is now incorporated in the analysis, which was obviously not the case 30 years ago and before. So it's interesting also to see how this now becomes part of the competition debate, and the question is whether online sales now play this immediate, effective, competitive constraint that leads to the conclusion that two products are part of the same relevant market, or whether they're just an additional competitive constraint, not so immediate, in which case, according to the new notice, there is a sentence there saying that really the decisive element is it's whether the constraint is really effective and immediate. Then the products can be considered as part of the same relevant market. If this is not the case, or the constraint is more vague or uncertain, then it becomes just part of the competitive assessment. So there's this distinction which I find interesting conceptually in the new notice. To some extent it helps because it clarifies it, says now the market definition is just a small thing and it's part of an overall competition assessment. But from another perspective it becomes more difficult because the boundaries become much more blurred, as Amélie said, and for us lawyers that are used to working with clear-cut concepts, it becomes really difficult, and we need more help from economists to analyze those aspects.
So thank you very much, and it's a very good transition to our last topic, which is the role of non-price factor. Maybe first question, or two questions for Emmanuel, and on the subject is because how do you see the role and the growing role of these non-price factors such as innovation, sustainability, quality? How do you see it in practice? First question, and the second question is from your perspective as an economist, what challenge arise when assessing competition in markets where price is no longer the dominant factor from your perspective?
Yeah, so maybe I will start with a very specific case because it's mentioned in the guidelines. It's when prices are equal to zero, so a service is free on the market. And so we are kind of lost because obviously applying a snip test to a good with a price that is equal to zero doesn't really make any sense. So it's one case where obviously competition is not about prices, so it must be about something else. That can be quality, that can be anything innovation, or any feature of the product. I think that's an interesting case because the guidelines precisely describe how you are supposed to work when this occurs, and they define a new test, which is SSNDQ, which is exactly the snip test, but applied to a decrease in quality. So the concept is really equivalent, is, well, if a firm decreases the quality of a good that's proposed for free, would consumers switch to an alternative good? Okay. So, at least in conceptual terms, that seems fine. Then in practical terms, I guess, that's very difficult to implement, and actually the Commission acknowledges this. So they say that, it works as a concept, but if you want to do it quantitatively, it's going to raise some complex issues. So maybe we can review some of these issues, because the Commission doesn't provide any guidance on this. So they just say, okay, that's a concept, it's difficult to use, but then, that's the concept, so just do something with that. So first, I guess, it's very difficult to define quality. So it may not be easy to define a price if you have a multidimensional good, but I guess it's even more difficult to define quality. I guess we all agree more or less when prices increase, even, if it's a very complex pricing scheme, but we may not all agree when quality falls. People may disagree about what quality is. So I don't know, if you take an example like web browsers, some people may like a browser that's very fast with very few options. Others may say, well, I'd rather have something that's a bit slower, but that gives me, all the customizing options, all the add-ons possible, and stuff like this. Well, if you decrease the speed of the browsers, are you decreasing quality or not? Well, that's not obvious from a consumer point of view. The other thing is that in the snip test, it's pretty clear what we mean by a 5% increase. A 5% decrease in quality is much harder to define. Okay? So if I take again the speed, does a 5% decrease in speed for web browser means anything? Well, I don't know. That's something you have to analyze. So the guidelines provide very little direction about how we should implement this. So they're, a bit on the advertising side. As economists, we can help, at least in some ways. So things we can do is first to define quality. Well, how can we do that? Well, one possibility would be, to look at multiple reviews or consumer advice on the web, and of course you will need like thousands of them. So you will need some quantitative algorithm to do that, and then extract from these what people say about the quality. So you may have reviews saying, well, this item is superior to another one because of this and that. Well, obviously this is something that people take into account, and we may focus on this to define quality. Another type of analysis we can do is using survey analysis, and more specifically what we call conjoint analysis, which is something that is very much used in marketing. So, without going into the technical details, it consists in decomposing a good into all its attributes, and then asking questions about, what if I change this attribute? How do you value this good? Would you rather have this good instead of this one? And then you combine all this data you get from the survey, and you can actually value each of these attributes. And then you can define what's a decrease in quality. You may say, well, if I decrease attribute A, then I know that people will care because, that's something they value very much in the surveys. And then that's mostly the difficult part, because when this is done, then you can look at changes over time in quality and see the effect on the market, just as you would do with prices. So with prices, we would say, well, 1 year ago, this firm increased its prices, and I could see people switching away, and that gives me a measure of the elasticity, so that helps in defining the market. Well, you could do the same with quality once you have this measure. So that's the first point about quality. Last one where I think the guidelines are a bit short is that they never consider the case where prices, goods with a zero price actually compete with other goods with a positive price. And I guess actually that's the most common case. So if you think about free TV and pay TV, or pay TV and streaming platforms like YouTube, or mobile phones, games on the mobile phones, some are free, some you have to pay for them, and all of them compete. Well, in that case, it's more difficult to do the test because with the non-zero price good, you should increase the price. With the zero price good, you should decrease the quality. How do you compare these two? So here again, I mean, you have some tools to do that. One of them is to define an implicit price for the zero price good. So going back to the example with the games on the mobile phone, you may say, well, people are actually willing to pay not to see any ads on the game. And so that gives me the price that they are willing to pay to avoid the free good. And so that's a kind of implicit price. And then I can say, well, if a firm would increase the quantity of ads, that would increase this price, and I can see the impact on competition, like people switching away from one type of game to another one. Okay, so that's something you can use as well. Okay, so that's a kind of new setting. It's a new test that wasn't obviously in the 97 guidelines, and we'll see how people use it. But that raises some important challenges. I'll be pretty brief on the other non-price factors. I guess one of them, a very important one, where the guidelines devote a lot of descriptions, is innovation. So the guidelines don't talk about innovation markets, they talk about innovation spaces. I'm not sure exactly the difference that it makes, but it doesn't really say, again, how you are supposed to define competition within these spaces. So they talk about, looking at R&D, what are the products in the pipeline, and there again, I think, as I said with quality, you have some specific tools where you can actually quantify the closeness of competition in the innovation space. And usually that involves looking at the patents that the firms are developing, looking at the description of these patents, and then you can measure how close they are, and so how close the firms are competing. So that's one aspect where actually there are many things to do, and the guidelines are a bit short on this. The last one, which I'm going to talk about, is sustainability. And there, I guess that will require a whole panel or a whole conference to address all these issues. One obvious point is that if quality is difficult to measure, then sustainability is extremely difficult to measure. So I don't know how competition authorities are going to handle this. The last point, which may be slightly more conceptual, is that if you start thinking in terms of sustainability, I think that's a real challenge to market definition. Because if you care about sustainability, then consumers that are out of the market may be affected by, say, an increase in prices within the market, okay, because of externalities. And so what's the point of defining the market if you want to take into account all the effects that occur outside of the market? Okay, so here you have to set clear boundaries, and the guidelines don't do that, about whether you should take that into account or not.
Thank you.
Can I just react?
Yeah, of course.
I think one thing that struck my mind also when I saw the addition of all the non-price factors is also the way it's going to be implemented in practice. I mean, as we know, what's stated is that price is obviously always the first factor. We established that it's not always relevant, but it is always a starting point in practice. Then the question is, what are the other factors how are they going to be integrated? I think you touched upon that. How do you mix factors together? Because if the result is just that you're going to define markets based on each factor, so you're going to have various segmentation based on price, to which you're going to add various segmentation based on sustainability, to which you're going to add another layer of segmentation based on innovation. I mean, what it does, it's just that it exponentially increases the number of potential segments on which, as we know, we always have to provide market share estimates. So the result is that we don't get one, my fear is, and once we've seen how it's implemented in practice, is that we're not necessarily going to end up with a more subtly defined market, but with authorities that are increasingly opening and closing every single door in the fear of missing something out. We don't know what, but something. We're going to end up with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of plausible markets on which we're going to have to provide data. Inevitably, there's going to be segmentation where any company will end up with a market share of 50% or plus, because the narrower you go, the closer you get to high numbers. And then you're going to, in practice, in merger cases at least, end up with incredibly complex pre-notification, more likely to escape simplified proceedings because there's going to be a doubt that potentially on one segmentation you might have 50% market share, in which case you launch into a full market investigation. So I think the question is, how do you work with all of those factors? They're all good ones, they're interesting and they're relevant, but in practice, is it really a market definition question? Or is it closeness of competition? Is it market dynamics? Is it a dynamic empirical assessment on a case-by-case basis? I feel that this goes into building a very strict framework, and we know the Commission has a tendency to be strict, and the hierarchy imposes that they have checklists that just keep getting longer. So I think complexifying market definition raises the fear that it's going to become an impossible exercise, and we're already not very popular in-house as competition lawyers because we work with market definitions that don't reflect the business market. But now we're going to come with not just one market or two markets or 10, it's going to be potentially 25, and not just in the cases that we notify, but also in cases that our competitors take forward because we get asked to participate in market definition for third-party cases. So our business teams are going to end up providing market share estimates on a rolling basis constantly, and I don't think that's necessarily helpful for competition law in general.
Thank you, Liliana.
And I would add to that that even when you provide the market shares, actually what the Commission may end up looking at eventually is the closeness of competition, because this is now an officially admitted concept into the guidelines. So whatever the market shares, actually it's just the starting point, and the Commission or the national competition authorities will look at how close competition is, and then they will take into account all the other factors that are mentioned, that we just discussed. Just a very quick note on the question of sustainability, which is, we talked here mainly on market definition of the relevant product or service market, but this is also reflected in the definition of the geographic market, which more or less remains the same, and there are less revolutionary or less volume of changes in this section, but still sustainability is also a factor that now participates into the not defining the homogeneous conditions of market competition from a geographical standpoint, but more the consumer preference. And I really, what strikes me reading through the notice is this several mentions of consumer preference and how important it is beyond the economic analysis and price factors or quality or other elements, but how the consumer perceives that. And sustainability does indeed participate into this perception, including for the definition of geographical market, because when you define a geographical area where the competitive conditions are homogeneous, you take into account transport costs, the distance, and how also aside from regulatory environment and other factors. But when you look at transport costs, you can also incorporate into this how sustainable it is to go and procure goods thousands of kilometers away or using plane. And in the Commission notice, there is an example in the product definition saying, well, when we look at product characteristics, you can say that a travel by plane or plane transport is limited to air travel. But in certain circumstances, train can also be taken into account. And there is an example with the route between London and Paris or London and Brussels, which is very easily interchangeable. But now when you take into account sustainability, you can apply this reasoning also to geographical markets that are much larger than that, because people in Europe, for example, those that are environmentally conscious might prefer to take the train even for very much longer distances and much more complicated including more expensive travels, because they would prefer a more sustainable travel. So this is how also these criteria are taken into account in the geographical dimension. And yeah,
maybe we just have time for closing remarks. If you, Amélie, you want to start for the few words?
Sure. Well, I think my message was quite clear. No, I do think that there is progress. I think there is merits in clarifying those concepts. I think clearly the 1997 notice was out of date, so there is a positive message. I do find some tension between the objective, which, as Liliana reminded, was that the market definition should be the starting point, kind of a rough assessment of the framework to assess competitive dynamics. And I feel that this very complex guidance leads to overcomplexifying the exercise. And I think my question, but it remains to be seen how it's going to be applied in practice, would be, is the question really, are you in or are you out? And are we not over-engineering that question versus are you close or not close competitors? Because I think, in essence, a merger is problematic when there is close competition. And I think this should be the focus. And I hope that the enhanced guidance will not lead us away from that questions to, over-engineering who is in, who is out.
Thank you. Emmanuel, Liliana, you want to say something? As you.
Just talking about legal certainty and what is the role of the guidance. Obviously, it's good to have, and this was one of the objectives, to have more transparency and predictability. Now, we realize that in practice, maybe it will be a little bit less predictable, but at least we know how will be, there's a French expression, in what sauce you are going to be eaten. My final remark is maybe to try and see how this can be used to what extent this can be used also by national competition authorities, because in France we have had precedents, in particular for zero monetary price goods like free-to-air TV, where the French Competition Authority and the administrative court that reviewed its decision took the position that they are not bound, at least in merger cases, they are not bound by the European Commission decisions. And we had a diverging practice on whether zero monetary price products, in this case free-to-air TV, was a relevant market or not. Here in the new guidance, there is a sentence which says precisely that it is not because a product has a zero monetary price that it's not a part of a relevant market. So I hope that this notice will lead to less divergence in the way that the market is defined in the different jurisdictions. But yeah, that's in terms of wishful thinking for more legal certainty and predictability.
Yes, so maybe a bit of international perspective to conclude. So I think it's interesting to look at what other competition authorities are doing. And so the CMA published some draft guidelines about assessing the strategic market status in digital markets. And so what the CMA says is that, here I'm quoting, assessing market power does not require a formal market definition exercise that involves drawing arbitrary lines. Okay, so that's a completely different standpoint from what the Commission is doing in the guidance. And then the CMA says, even goes further, goes one step beyond, and states that assessing adverse effects on competition does not require market definition. So you see the completely different point of view. And what's interesting, surprising, you can put it as you want, in the guidance is that for the European Commission, market definition remains a central component even in the digital sector, despite actually everything that it describes, the zero prices, the dynamic competition, the non-price factors, the forward-looking assessment. I mean, despite all this, it puts all that and tries to integrate it into market definition, whereas the CMA, rightly or wrongly, just says the opposite. It says, well, that becomes too complex, and so just have a look. Let's have a look at the competitive constraints, and that will be much more efficient.
Thank you. Maybe we have time for one or two questions, if there is any. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for very practical discussion. I'm Daniel from Delivery Hero in-house counsel, so certainly agree with a lot of the challenges you mentioned. We do also face a lot of difficulties in explaining food delivery sector. We try always to define the markets as eat at home, because we see, I mean, you have mentioned consumer choices, and this is essentially we were trying to say that when you are at home, you decide to deliver, to get something delivered to your place, or maybe you cook, right? Or you go to a restaurant next to your house. This is really not taken into account by competition authorities, I would say, nowhere in the world. But so I would appreciate if, I guess what authorities are having difficulties is to create objective criteria out of potential consumer choices. Again, taking the example of the bag, eventually we could say that this bag competes with art or cars or real estate. But again, then authority will say, yeah, but how can I come up with some objective criteria that would create legal certainty? So I would appreciate if you can share some thoughts of which criteria we could propose to authorities.
Yeah, you know, I would say it's always the same type of analysis, but you have to broaden the scope. So as you said, I mean, substitution patterns may be way out of the market that you anticipate in the first place. And so the point is, you know, to have this very broad point of view and say, well, actually we think that, you know, people may compare very different types of goods. And then, of course, you know, you have to provide some evidence. But in a way, I think, you know, the framework is still the same. It's just that you have to convince that the way people consume is not necessarily within a very narrow market, but they may consider, like, as you say, you know, a car and, I don't know, a bag, because, you know, they just, if I go back to my example, they just want to show social status. And you can do that in many ways. You know, you can buy a Ferrari, but you can also have this very expensive boat. And, you know, that does the same job. It's just that a competition authority would say, wait a minute, I mean, obviously you can't substitute for this because it's not different, it's a different usage. But what matters is not the use you make of that. It's just that you want to show you own this product. But yeah, I guess, you know, again, be as large as possible in the way you look at the substitution patterns and check whether it works or not.
Just a short point on the evidence, precisely because we didn't touch upon this subject, but there's a huge section now. There was a very small one in the 1997 notice, but now there's a huge section on evidence and what is acceptable evidence. And I would say this also reflects, you know, the concern of getting more consumer-based feedback, not only, you know, economic analysis, even though it's very important, it's the starting point. But the more market assessments are provided, the more evidence it is for the case you would like to make, regardless of the criteria you use, because obviously the criteria that depend on the product and the service and the geography. So it's really a case-by-case analysis, but what is important is to support it with evidence. And there is this very informative sentence also in the notice, which says that a good evidence is a reliable evidence. And so the direction is that you should have more, if you provide studies, they should be provided if, I mean, they have more authority if they are, they have been compiled and written before the relevant point in time that you're considering. And I recently heard on a conference that in Poland there was a recent precedent, precisely in the online sales market, where the Polish Competition Authority refused to take any economic studies that were produced on purpose, saying that, well, they were just commissioned and so they have no value. And here in the notice you have paragraphs that explain that evidence that's studies that are produced by public authorities, for example, have a lot of value, or studies that are produced before the relevant facts. So just do your job to collect studies before you get into a procedure.
And just to add to your point, another striking point on evidence is also the fact that the Commission says explicitly that evidence that comes from market participants with conflicting interest have a higher value, which I found shocking, frankly. I mean, that you would also take into account conflicting views seems natural, but the fact that you'd consider it's a higher value, I think shows some form of suspicion, which I don't think is necessarily helpful, because I think we all want to get to a market definition and we all have genuine views. And I think, yeah, coming to evidence, I did find a lot of suspicion towards parties and economists, which I'm not sure is necessarily very healthy, because again, nobody's trying to lie or make anything up. I think we're just trying to get the deals through.
Thank you very much, our speakers. Thank you all. And we are perfectly on time for the lunch.